In this lesson, we're going to be going over how to display a damage indicator on our screen. So in our last lesson, we went over how to deduct from the armor and the health bars, but we also want to have an image appear on our screen, a blood splatter effect or something of that sort, so that we know we're taking damage as well. So we're going to be using a blood splatter effect that's going to be fading into our screen. Now to get started, we are going to be in the lesson 6 start. That's going to be in the project source files. It will include everything that you need. So if we take a look at the UI folder, you should have this blood image right here. If you don't have this, you can go into the project files. So in the project source files under lesson 6, you're going to have the starting package, and in the assets folder, you're also going to find the same image in here as well. So if it doesn't show up in the scene itself, just drag this into your project panel. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to set this image up to be a sprite 2D and UI texture type. So up in the top over here in the inspector panel, we're going to set this texture type from texture down to sprite 2D and UI. This is going to be a single image or a single sprite. So we want to make sure that the sprite mode is set to single and then click apply. Now, as you can see, this image is fairly big. It's 1920 by 1080. It's going to appear over the entirety of our screen. So what we need to do now is create a UI image under our canvas. So once again, go underneath the UI system. We're going to right click in here, UI, and then image. This will make a child object of the canvas itself. And that's going to be in the center point to start off. Let's just go and rename this to damage right now. So damage, I'm going to redo that. All right, so damage. Now we need to assign our image. So just drag it into the slot for the source image slot right there. It is fairly small right now, so we need to change the size of this. Now we're not going to be adjusting the width and height of this image. Instead, we're going to go into the anchor presets itself. Now holding down Shift and Alt, you're going to get a few different options, and we're going to click on the bottom right over here. Now what that's going to do is it's going to stretch the image out over the entirety of our canvas. So it's essentially the same size now. So go ahead and close that up. And now we're going to be taking a look at the image itself. Let's go and swap to the scene view real quick. So you can see what the image looks like, but you'll notice that it's covering up all the other UI elements. Now this is something that we kind of briefly discuss here and there, but if you take a look at the damage image, it's at the bottom of the stack right here. Now typically, any UI elements that appear at the bottom are going to be seen first. So that's why you can see the image or the blood splatter image effect above everything else. Now, if we want this to appear behind everything else, we need to move this to the top of the stack. So let's just move this up to the very top, behind or above the crosshair right here. That way the crosshair image is also displayed above our blood splatter effect here. Now you could use whatever image you want for this. This is the image that I'm going to be using for the damage effect. Now we need to combine this with a script. We don't want this to be displayed at all times. We only want this to be displayed whenever we take damage. So we're going to be going into the UI script, and then we're also going to be taking a look at the trigger script as well. So go ahead and select the UI canvas and then double click on the UI script. Alright, so at the very top we have another image that we're going to be adding into our image line right here. It's called damage, which is going to be our damage UI element. So public image, crosshair, health bar, armor, and then damage. Now in here we have a public bool. This is going to be used within another script, which is the trigger script. So we want to make sure this is set to bool. So public bool is damaged. So this will allow us to see if we are actually taking damage. Next we have a public float. We're going to be using this to fade in the image itself. So public float flash speed. Now within the awake function, we're going to be setting the alpha value of that image to start. So damage.crossfade alpha, and we're going to be using this in a moment, but crossfade alpha, the first one is going to be the alpha value. So by default, we don't want it to be opaque. We want it to be fully transparent, which is going to be 0. If you want it to be opaque or fully visible, you're going to have it set to 1. Next, we have the duration. So we're going to be using this when we fade in the alpha value. In this case, since we're not fading anything in, we're going to set this to 0. Then finally, we have the time scale. So do we want this to ignore time scale or not? Ignore time scale is set to false, meaning we are going to be using time scale even with this. Time scale is typically used if you pause your game. So if you pause your game, you're typically going to set the time scale to something like 0, meaning you're going to be pausing the time in the game. In this case, we don't want to be able to ignore that, so we're going to set this to false. Next, within the update function, we're just going to be checking for damage fade. And let's take a look at the function down here. So this is all commented out as well. So void damage fade, if is damage. So is damage is a Boolean variable. And when we write it out like this, that means true. You could also see it like this. So equals true. It's the same thing. It's just a little bit shorter to write it like this. So is damage. If you want to set this to false, you would just add in an exclamation point in front of it. So if is damage, then we're going to be using the crossfade alpha. Now this time we're going to be using a value of 1 for the crossfade. So this is the alpha value right here. So 1 is going to be fully opaque. Then we have the flash speed. So how quickly does it fade into that new state? And then finally, once again, we have the ignore timescale. We're not going to be ignoring the timescale, so we're going to be setting this to false. Now, if this Boolean variable is false, that means we're going to go down into the else statement. So else damage crossfade alpha. And then we have 0 once again for the alpha value. So we're going to be setting it back to its transparent state over 1 second, and then false once again for the ignore timescale. So you'll notice that we're only using flash speed right here. So we're going to have it move a little bit slower when it fades into the fully opaque state versus going back to its transparent state, which is going to be much quicker at 1. All right, go ahead and save that. Minimize this. Let's take a look at our new element within our UI script. All right, so our damage image just appeared. Let's just drag in our damage image from the hierarchy into that new slot, which is right underneath the armor bar. There we go. And then we need to adjust the flash speed. So this is really up to you. I'm just going to start off with something slow like 5. So it's going to take about 5 seconds to fully fade into that opaque value. So 5 seconds is pretty slow. So once again, the flash speed refers to how quickly it fades into that new value, which is the fully opaque version of that image. Right, now we need to adjust the values within our trigger script. So let's go into the damage trigger. All right, so at the very top, we have a reference to our UI script. UI script is the one that we just modified. So public UI script. And then in the start function, I do have a reference to the get component in here as well. UI script equals UI script.get component UI. Then finally, we have in the on trigger enter, we have a new line in here. So when we enter that trigger, we're going to be taking damage. But we also want to make sure that the isDamage Boolean variable is set to true. So we are taking damage. We're going to be displaying that image now. Now we also need a way to be able to set that Boolean variable back down to false. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be saying on trigger exit. When we walk out of that trigger, we're then going to be setting it back down to false because we're no longer taking damage. Right? So UI script.isDamage equals false. Just going to save that out. Now this trigger script has been applied to the cube already. We just modified it. So everything has been applied already. All right, now we need to add the script that we need for our trigger, which is going to be our UI script. So let's go into our cube. And if you take a look at the damage trigger, we now have a slot for the UI script, which is on our UI element, which is the canvas. Just drag that into that slot. There we go. So now it knows what to reference for the UI script. And let's give this a quick test. Let's hit play. All right, so I'm going to walk into the trigger. You can see it appears. And the longer we stay in there, the fully opaque version of the image appears. If I walk out, you can see how quickly it fades out. Now you could adjust the flash speed as well if you want it to appear much quicker. But right now we're walking into this. You can see how long it takes for it to fully fade in. Walk out, it fades out much quicker. So once again, if we take a look at the UI script, we can adjust the flash speed down to say 1 second. So it's just as quick fading in and fading out. So once again, walk in, you can see how quick that fades in. Walk out, it fades out just as quick. All right, and there we go. So we have a very simple way to take damage and display a damage indicator on our screen using a simple image and a couple of crossfade alpha values.